Step into the squared circle, where the bell echoes through decades, where main events become legends and tag teams tore the house down. From the undercard to the top of the card, this is Portland Wrestling at its finest. One ring, one city, 1,000 stories. This is Ringside in Rose City. And here's your hosts, Frank Culbertson and Mike Rodgers.
Hey, thank you, Lisa. I'm Frank Culbertson, sitting alongside the walking encyclopedia of Portland Wrestling himself, historian, author, referee extraordinaire,
Mike Rodgers.
And this is Ringside in Rose City. One ring, one city, and 1,000 stories. Now, before we get started, I have to point out that Mike and I have been doing this long enough that we've developed a system. And by system, I mean Mike spends hours researching old newspapers, wrestling programs, newsletters, magazine articles, and results from 60 years ago, and I show up and ask questions. It's a remarkably effective partnership. Mike does all the work, and I take all the credit. It's worked beautifully so far. Of course, every week we tell ourselves we're going to stay focused. We're going to stay on topic. We're going to be disciplined professionals. And every week, Lisa hears that, and Lisa laughs at us and immediately sends us in a completely different direction. Because as our listeners know, Lisa has one job around here, and that is to create chaos. And she is very good at it. So before Mike can bury himself in another stack of newspapers, and before I accidentally ask him a question that turns into a 20-minute story, Lisa, go ahead and spin that ringside wheel, and let's see what kind of trouble you've gotten us into tonight.
Here you go.
Thank you. Mike, I have to admit, this may be the most dangerous envelope we've ever opened. Because unlike our normal shows, this one isn't coming from Don Owen or the Portland Sports Arena or some newspaper from 1969. This is coming from your own files. And that's a very scary thought because Lisa somehow got her hands on 30 years of Ring Around the Northwest newsletters. How? Trust me, you don't want to know. But whenever Lisa gets access to that much information, nothing good happens. For you. Now, Mike, I've got all 30 years now sitting right here. Every issue, every Hall of Fame class, all 22 of them. But before we get to the names, a couple of questions. What made you decide to start Ring Around the Northwest, and how was it received by wrestlers and by fans?
Well, I had a very good friend, Ken Hamlin, who has just passed away in this last year. He was doing a bulletin called Ring Around the World, and I was helping him. It was lots of fun. I think we both really, really enjoyed it. And I was writing for him a little bit and helping him out. And I thought, well, I'd like to do a sister publication. His was called Ring Around the World. I want to call mine Ring Around the Northwest. And so I started in May of 1983. It was about 3 pages long. I charged 50 cents. This is before the internet. There were a lot of bulletins around this time since it was pre-internet. That was the way wrestling fans got their information. So there was wonderful bulletins, Mat Results by Jay Steele. Tom Burke had Global Wrestling. A gentleman that I met at the Portland Sports Arena one time, Jeff Mullins, had a bulletin called Pro Wrestling Sushi, and a lot of humor in that. Way back in the 70s, Dave Meltzer had, before the Observer, a bulletin called International Wrestling Gazette. So there was a lot of bulletins. And so I just joined in with them. Very, very small bulletin. And at that time, the wrestlers had no idea. They had no idea that this existed. And not very many fans knew it either. I think I probably printed out 25 that first little bit. Eventually, I ended up printing out about 100 to 125. So it picked up. It took a while before I started having interviews. And that primarily came after I started attending Dean Silverstone's reunion, and I got to meet some of the wrestlers and everything. And then as I'm going along, I thought, oh, Ring Around the Northwest should have its own Hall of Fame where we really honor the wrestlers and the personalities that have taken place in the Northwest. So I didn't just include Portland wrestling, I included the Vancouver promotion as well.
So we've done a podcast on the Mount Rushmore of Portland wrestling. How is the Hall of Fame different? What are your criteria for someone to make the Hall of Fame? Did they have to hold championships, draw sellouts, sell a bunch of merch?
As I look at that year one, for me, year one was really, really easy. It's the wrestlers who have made the biggest contributions to the Northwest. You move to year 2 and it continues with that importance. There's total impact. Who drew the houses, longevity of wrestler, charisma, being a champion, the total package. And at some point, we'll probably get to some of these wrestlers on this show. They're wrestlers who weren't always on top, but they're important to the overall Northwest wrestling scene. And good example is Sandy Barr. Sandy Barr didn't hold any championships, but he wrestled. He ended up being a promoter, and he's important to the Northwest scene. So even though he didn't have extreme success as a singles wrestler, he's still going to be honored.
It's interesting you said that the first year was easy, and the second year, I know you've mentioned, wasn't too difficult either. And that really shows the historian perspective that you come from, because most fans would remember 80 with Martel and Piper, the Sheepherders and Rose and Wiskowski, and all those names would go on right away. But there's so much history before that deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. So we'll talk about those as we go. And tonight, we're not going to get to all the names. And so I'm going to read off some names, and then from every year as we go, and then you tell me which ones you want to focus on and give us that information. So tonight, I'm going to start at the very beginning. We're going to pull out the very first Hall of Fame class and take a look at some of the names you selected. As you mentioned, probably won't be the biggest names every time. We've spent plenty of episodes talking about some of the legends, but we're going to talk about names our listeners might not know, but they deserve to know the full story. So let's start the very first Ring Around the Northwest Hall of Fame class. It's Lonnie Main, Dutch Savage, Ed Francis, Frank Stochak, Don Owen, Gorgeous George, Kurt Von Poppenheim, Don Leo Jonathan, Gene Kaninsky, Tony Bourne, and Buddy Rose. That is an impressive and well-deserving list of wrestlers for the first year of the Hall of Fame. And the first name that I'm going to tell you I want to talk about is one of the biggest stars professional wrestling has ever produced, and that's Gorgeous George. Mike, when people hear the name Gorgeous George today, they know he's important, but I don't think fans understand why he's important. So start there. Who was Gorgeous George, and why was he such a significant part of wrestling history?
This one is interesting. This year 1, for some reason, there's 11 wrestlers. Most years there's 10, but this first year, I don't know if I just couldn't not eliminate one wrestler to have 10. So yeah, this year is a little bit different. Gorgeous George, probably one of the, before the Hulk Hogan era, Gorgeous George was probably the most famous, definitely most famous mainstream. In the early 60s, he was a household name. He was on the late night shows like Johnny Carson and shows like that. People knew who Gorgeous George was. And he started in the Northwest. His name was George Wagner. And the story is his wife had made him a robe, and he's in Eugene wrestling, and he just takes his sweet time taking off this robe, and he folds it, and he takes extreme care to it. And all the time he's kind of stalling, and the heat is building. And he just took it from that point and just moved it to the next level. And eventually he has a male valet who's spraying perfume. He's got Georgie hairpins that he's giving out as souvenirs, and he's pushing it to the next level. Now, I've got a couple interesting Gorgeous George stories. When I was in high school, I had already purchased the book, Whatever Happened to Gorgeous George. And I'm walking into my cafeteria at my high school, and I look over, and there's a crowd of people around this table. And this boy has put all these pictures on the table. And I stopped and I looked. He's got pictures of Gorgeous George. And people are looking at them, And I came through and I said, "Where did you get these?" He said, "My mom was married to Gorgeous George." And I go, "That's incredible." And he said, "I've got a book. I'll loan you." He said, "Gorgeous George wasn't my dad. My mom was married to Gorgeous George." It was interesting because later on, his mom called me and asked me, this was before I ever started writing books. She asked me if I would write her story. And that honor went to somebody else. I told her I had no connections, no idea how that would work. Anyway, that book did get written. And then I've seen her, Gorgeous George was honored by the WWF. And I saw her before she passed away on stage accepting that award. So that was really exciting that, they happen to live in Seaside.
Oh, that is an amazing story. And you mentioned the Georgie hairpins. They not only were used in his hair, but he also got stuck with them, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. They became part of the gimmicks going each way as foreign objects each way for him and against him.
Okay. Well, that's a great story for the first year, but Ted, we've talked about all the other names in the past. So let's move on to year two. And year two is Roddy Piper, Whipper Watson, Bull Ramos, Billy Jack, Ted Thigh, Dan Stasiak, Daniel McDonald, Mad Dog Vachon, and Jack McLaughlin. So from year two, who do you want to talk about? And again, what an impressive list of names.
You know, I did enlist a little bit of help. J. Michael Kenyon was one of the most outstanding wrestling journalists, and I knew that I didn't have a handle on wrestlers from the early 60s and later than that. So I could do the research and see the names that kept popping up, but it's just like Ultimate Warrior. We see that he's on top of cards, but the majority of the smart fans know he is not a very good wrestler. He has charisma. He's on top because the fans like him, but he's not a very good wrestler. So I asked J. Michael Kenyon, you know, when I'm asking his advice on wrestlers to be considered and everything, and he would give me his advice on who was a solid worker. And year two results came out, and he was very almost indignant that I included Whipper Watson in this list. But Whipper Watson came to Vancouver in 1953, and during the 53, he went to a draw with Lou Thez in an NWA title match. And again, these are all from Vancouver. He came back in 55. He came back in 56. In 56, he is the NWA champion. He beats Hardboiled Haggerty. He goes to a draw with Lou Thez. In 57, he beats Dick Hutton, another NWA champion. He beats Lou Thez on DQ. He comes back in 59. He beats Kaninsky. Now he's no longer the NWA champ, but he goes to a draw with the NWA champ, Pat O'Connor. He comes back in 60. He has wins over Don Leo Jonathan, Antonio Leone, Gene Kaninsky. Goes to another draw with Pat O'Connor. This is a regular run for Watson in 1960. It's not just coming in for a show or two. He's got a regular run. In 61, it continues. He beats Gorgeous George. He beats the outlaw Dory Funk Sr., goes to a draw with Edward Carpentier, and they kind of create a title, or he brings a title into the area. He is the British Empire champ, and he trades that back and forth with Kaninsky several times. In 62, he's the tag champ with Bearcat Wright, and now you're starting to see age a little bit catch up with him. In 63, he beats Don Leo Jonathan, Waldo Von Erich, Kinjai Shibuya, and he doesn't wrestle there for 3 years, and he comes back in 1966, and he has his last match in the Northwest. He loses to a wrestler named Bill Dromo. And then shortly after that, he's involved in an automobile accident that ends his wrestling career. But J. Michael, despite all that impressive results that I've just read, J. Michael Kenyon shook his head at this. He was evidently not a great worker.
Well, somebody believed in him because he was clearly on top for quite a long time. So that's interesting. Is there anybody else on that list you want to spotlight?
Daniel McDonald's on there, and Daniel McDonald was not on top. So here's a great example of somebody that we're going to honor. But if you had to say who had the most wrestling matches in the history of the Northwest, it would probably be one of two people. It would be Kurt von Poppenheim and or Daniel McDonald. So his career was very, very long, and he got plenty of wins, but he is not on the level of the other wrestlers on this list, the Roddy Pipers, the Billy Jacks, the Bull Ramos, Stan Stasiak, but still he deserves this spot and deserves to be honored.
Yeah, he's a guy who you can see wrestled just about everybody, and it didn't matter win or loss. He was going to be there. He's one of those guys that would fill the cards, could wrestle anybody, any style, so definitely deserves. And we're going to move on to year three, but I just want to say, are you pleased that I didn't just stop the broadcast so that we could talk only about Stan Stasiak?
We talk about him every week.
And we should.
Yeah.
Oh, as I mentioned, we're up to year three. Let's look at that list. Shag Thomas, who we've been talking about in the 1968-69 on the podcast. John Tolos, which is how you spell wrestling. Bulldog Brown, Harry Elliott, Jimmy Snuka, Jack Forscombe, Ripper Collins, the Royal Kangaroos, Paul Bosch, Roy McClarty. The lists just keep getting amazing. I'm not sure how you pick names. Everyone is deserving, and we're only in year 3. So who gets the spotlight in year 3?
You know, I've said before, I believe that one of the greatest heels that I ever saw was Ripper Collins. His name is going to be lost to wrestling history, except for the people who really had a chance to see him. When he came into Portland in, I believe, 1973, he was pushed those first few weeks like nobody has ever been pushed before. The things that he did to get over, he would file his teeth like Fred Blassie. He introduced his finishing move, which was called the O-Poo drop, which was essentially just a knee to the other wrestler's nuts. And everybody was always scratching their head if that was legal or not, but he kept doing it and he never got disqualified. Now, Dutch Savage had teamed with Ripper Collins in Hawaii a few years prior, and Dutch Savage went out of his way to get Ripper Collins over because in one of those first 2 or 3 weeks, they had an angle and Ripper Collins interfered in one of Savage's matches. And I think he ended up giving him 3 O-Poo drops.
Oh, well, now we know why Dutch was salty.
Yes, absolutely. So in my mind, and Ripper Collins had that great, how can I describe this? His persona was a little bit effeminate because it's no secret that Ripper Collins was gay. But he had that little bit of that where people would call him out on that possibility. But at the same time, he was brutal and had a extremely mean streak to him. So he wouldn't beg off all the time. You know, he had that really interesting mix in his personality and his persona. One of the greatest heels I've ever seen.
And I should mention that because it's plug time, that you can learn a lot about Ripper Collins in not only the Encyclopedia of Portland Wrestlers, but you can find out about him in, the history of Hawaiian wrestling, both available on Amazon. And there's a whole bunch of information and pictures about Ripper Collins because he really was one of the major stars in Hawaii wrestling for a number of years and settled there long afterwards and actually married a woman there. And they had a great relationship. And that's how you got to Dean Silverstone, isn't it?
Right. Dean Silverstone was very good friends with Ripper Collins. They met up in Hawaii, and Dean Silverstone's wife, Ruth, enjoyed that visit so much. She said, "Are there any other characters that we can meet that you know from wrestling?" And that's how the reunion was created, just by Ruth's thoughts there.
There might be a character or two in wrestling, or maybe somebody who isn't a character, maybe 1 or 2 of those. But there's another guy on this list I know that you want to talk about. So let's talk about Paul Bosch.
Paul Bosch, you know, we've done shows on, did you know that this wrestler wrestled in the Northwest? We've done whole shows on this, and I don't think we've talked about Paul Bosch. You know, everybody knows Paul Bosch as being the promoter from Houston. And when you talk about the top promoters in the country throughout the years, there's usually 2 names that wrestlers will bring up. Usually the first one is Paul Bosch, and then the second one is Don Owen, as far as being fair payoff men and just good quality promoters. So Paul Bosch wrestled here way back, probably in the late 30s, early 40s, and was very successful, you know, and then he moved on. So the point, you know, is just the fact that he did start out very, very early in his career and had success here. It's standalone success. He earns his spot by his success that he had while he was here.
Yeah, and had an absolutely great physique back in the day when he was wrestling, and of course going on to great success as a promoter. And so we're on to year 4, and it's another great list. The first guy you've mentioned, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, Dandy Sandy Barr, Buddy Knox, Bob Krause, Danny McShane, Rod Fenton, Luther Lindsay, again, a name we've talked a lot about on recent podcasts, and someone so important in the history of Portland wrestling. Abdullah the Butcher, now that's a name I can't wait to hear about. The Skull or Brute, the Von Steigers, a top tag team for sure, and Sander Kovacs. Mike, talk about a couple of guys on that list.
Yeah, we mentioned Sandy Barr. This is only year 4. Sandy Barr doesn't make it on his wrestling ability alone. His longevity, is someone you have to recognize. He homesteaded here, of course. So he has, I don't know, 10, 15 years of wrestling here, became a promoter, became a dad of famous wrestlers. He deserves this spot, and we mentioned him a little bit earlier. The Skull, who wrestled here as the Skull, he wrestled in Vancouver as the Brute, and he's probably better known to other territories as Bugsy McGraw. The Skull, again, I've mentioned Ripper Collins was one of the best heels. The Skull, another fantastic heel, came here in 1971. Tony Bourne was his manager. Tony Bourne brought him in to get Lonnie Main. So they were involved in a great feud. And the Skull makes the impression by the very first time Tony Bourne hands him raw chicken, and the Skull is eating this raw chicken. And it's like, raw chicken? I can hear my mom right now. Not raw chicken. Give you salmonella. But that's how bad the Skull was. And he tells the story of Don Owen kind of giving him his notice and sending him on his way up to Vancouver. And Sander Kovacs, who's the promoter in Vancouver, and he's on year 4, he praised the Brute as being his number 1 box office wrestler ever, which is amazing considering Don Leo Jonathan and John Tolos and Bulldog Brown and Gene Kaninsky. The Skull is the one person who essentially drew the most money, at least in his window of time. So another one of my favorite wrestlers.
And you mentioned Don giving him notice. Now, at the interview with the raw chicken, which, yeah, probably not a good thing. But one of the reasons was the Skull didn't really talk, did he? Because he had a little speech impediment. And that's one of the reasons Don didn't really want him around, isn't it?
Right. He had that speech impediment, and Don ended up making a little bit of fun of him, that Bugsy didn't handle very well. And he was kind of glad to leave and stick it in Don's face that he was a great draw, and it's an interesting little tidbit because almost everybody will say glowing things about Don Owen. And that's very rare. You can't have 100%. And the Skull was salty. He was salty at Don.
Yes, he was. And another name on the list that we don't have to cover much of, but I know there are listeners who right now are going, Abdullah the Butcher never wrestled in Portland. And he never did he?
No, he never wrestled in Portland, but his run in Vancouver was incredible. He came in June of 1967. In preliminaries, he beats Rick Ronaldo, Sandy Barr, Roy McClarty. By July, he's moved up to main events, and he was unbeatable. He beats John Tolos, Chris Tolos, Don McClarty, Rocky Johnson, Red McNulty, who's Ivan Koloff, Abdul the Butcher versus Ivan Koloff, which is just a TV match. Leo Burke, he beats Don Leo Jonathan. So he came in June. September 4th is his first loss. It's to John Tolos. Then he turns around and beats John Tolos in a Sudan death strap match. He beats Don Leo Jonathan in a Texas death match. He starts teaming with Jerry Graham, which Abdul the Butcher and Dr. Jerry Graham is something that you just almost can't fathom. And they become the tag champs. They feud with the Assassins, heel and heel tag team. Some of those matches had to be just great. He gets an NWA title match against Kaninsky. Kaninsky wins. Here's one. On March 4th, he faces Lou Thez, and Lou Thez beats Abdul the Butcher on disqualification. Later in March, he wrestles Bobo Brazil in Vancouver and loses on disqualification. Now, we are probably in about May of 1968, and now he starts losing matches, which he loses to people that he shouldn't lose to. And it's his sign that his time is coming up. But he keeps staying in the area. He starts losing matches in May, but he doesn't leave until September. But he does win the tag titles again with Armand Hussein. They beat the Von Steigers. They beat Don Leo Jonathan and Haystacks Calhoun. And here we are into August of 68. Here's the people that he loses to. Bobby Shane, no shame in that. Johnny Costas, Dean Higuchi, Patty Barrett, He's losing to these guys now. And he definitely had wins over those guys at his debut. But anyway, he's in Vancouver for over a year and just a gigantic run, especially in those first 3 or 4 months.
So I'm going to let you put on your total guess hat, as you like to do. And so why didn't Abdullah come down to Portland? Because Don brought in a lot of Vancouver guys, but Abdullah never made it to Portland.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because we know that Don was not afraid to use African-American wrestlers and he was not afraid to push African-American wrestlers. Oh, but maybe this is it. Well, not very often would he use a heel African-American wrestler. He did. Shag Thomas was a heel for quite some time, but you probably could not turn Abdul the Butcher into a baby face. And he probably just did not want an African-American heel wrestler in his territory. That's the only thing. I don't know that they ever crossed paths. He probably got a report of exactly the type of wrestler he was. But yeah, that is an interesting question.
He is not the picture that you see when you open up the dictionary and look up action wrestler that no one liked.
No, even in 1967, he was much slimmer than what we imagine him as now. But yeah, even a young Abdullah is not an action wrestler.
So think about that. In 68, he comes in and he tags with Lonnie Main. That'd have been a great tag.
That would have been unbelievable.
Okay, 5 years in and the classes continue to absolutely blow my mind. The talent in the Northwest, it was so good. We have Kenji Shibuya, Eric Stairwell Pedersen, Guy Mitchell, Big John Quinn, Celie Samara, and the person who held the Northwest title more than anyone, the crippler, Rip Oliver, Paavo Ketonen, a man who we will be covering a lot more in upcoming podcast, covering August 69 through 1970s, and that's the colorful Beauregard. And finally, the fabulous Kangaroos, not the Royal Kangaroos, but the fabulous Kangaroos. Mike, who are we talking about in that list?
One name slipped by. Bill Savage also is in this list. Let's talk about Celie Samara, who is not very well known by even historians. There was a really great article by Corey Santos on the life of Celie Samara. He started as a boxer in the New Jersey area, and this is in the 30s. He became a wrestler in 1934. He came into the Northwest and in the heavyweight promotion. He came here in February 28th of 1945, and he had initial success, had some big wins. He had wins over Lee Grable, Jim Wright, Strangler Lewis, Cliff Theed, Ted Christie, Jack Forsgren, the French Angel, Maurice Tillet. But the one thing that really, really makes you stand up and look at him was he had a win over Lou Thez in the Northwest. And that just did not happen, even at any point in his career, but this is early in 1945. He also held Lou Thez to several draws, which means that Lou Thez had to have respected him. Absolutely.
Because you weren't going to beat Lou Thez unless Lou Thez wanted you to beat him.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. He retires in 1956. He goes back to New Jersey. He passes away at a very young age of 53, and that was in 1964. And also another Northwest connection was Luther Lindsay was a protege of Celie Samara.
Yeah, he's a super interesting guy. Listeners, you should look him up. There's a lot of great information, but he was a very, very good wrestler. So there's a name in there, and I probably pronounced it wrong, but Paavo Ketonen. Tell me about him, Mike.
He was a Finnish wrestler who came to the Northwest, one of those old timers. He was tough as nails, held some titles, just one of those wrestlers from the 40s, probably stuck around to the early 50s. I have one interesting story. I used to get a letter, and it would have $1 to pay for Ring Around the Northwest, and it was from an Arizona address. Never had a name, and I would just always put the address without any name on it and send Ring Around the Northwest. Now, I don't know how I learned this, but when Paavo Ketonen passed away, somehow I learned of Paavo Ketonen's address. And it was not this address that the dollar kept coming to, but it was right down the street. So I don't know if Paavo was like didn't want to include his name, obviously so, didn't want to have it sent direct. Kayfabe was strong, didn't want to have it sent right to his own address, but perhaps a neighbor's address right down the street or next door. I found that really, really interesting.
I don't want to talk a lot about this team, but the Fabulous Kangaroos and not the Royal Kangaroos, that can be a little bit confusing, but the Fabulous Kangaroos were not in Portland, were they?
No, they were in Vancouver. There was many, many versions of the Kangaroos, but this version was Al Costello and Roy Hefferman. And they were a great tag team. They had some matches with Don Leo Jonathan and Roy McClarty. And I had a chance to talk a little bit with Al Costello. I didn't do an interview, but he did answer some questions. And that was the one question that I was so interested in. And I talked with Don Leo about it. How could they take 2-hour draws, and what was the philosophy? And they did. They had, I think, 2 different 2-hour draws in Vancouver. And how could they build and work with the crowd and keep them with them for 2 hours? Don Leo Jonathan just shrugged his shoulders and said, it was easy. You knew how to work. It didn't matter if you were going 5 minutes or 2 hours. Same thing with Al Costello, who had that nickname, a man of 1,000 holds. Even though he was more or less a heel, he was definitely a wrestling heel. For them, they just had that talent and they could just work long, long matches like that.
Wow. So that's the first 5 years. And so as we start to look at years...
Frank, it's that time.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, you hear that music. Yeah, Lisa's playing it right now, nice and loud here in the studio. That means it's time once again for Kayfabe Curveballs, the game where wrestling logic, random trivia, and complete chaos all get thrown into the same steel cage. And normally Lisa's questions can come from absolute anywhere. Could be wrestling history, could be sports, could be movies, food, geography, television, science. And after the last edition of Kayfabe Curveballs, I'm still recovering. Because as our listeners will remember, Lisa somehow convinced you to attempt a foxtrot in the studio, and you decided it was a good idea to sing the Popeye theme song on the air.
That was not a good idea.
Oh my gosh. Well, let's relive that moment.
Popeye the Sailor Man. Popeye the Sailor Man. That's all I know.
There it is. Oh, man, I witnessed both events, and I have not slept properly since. Mike, there are horror movies that are less disturbing. But tonight is a little different. Tonight we're talking about the Ring Around the Northwest Hall of Fame and the names you've honored over the years. So in keeping with that Hall of Fame theme, every question tonight has something to do with the Hall of Fame. Now, before you get too comfortable, I should point out that I never said Wrestling Hall of Fame. This could be Sports Hall of Fame questions, Music Hall of Fame questions, Movie Hall of Fame questions, famous inductees, famous omissions, or because Lisa's involved, some Hall of Fame that nobody has ever heard of, but somehow has existed since 1947. The challenge remains simple. You answer the questions, and we find out whether your legendary memory extends beyond Portland wrestling and into the hallowed halls of greatness everywhere, or whether you've devoted every available brain cell to remembering who wrestled in Salem on a rainy Thursday night in 1968. So, Lisa, open the Hall of Fame vault, polish the plaques, and hand me question number 1.
Here you go.
Thank you. Oh, Mike, listen to this.
Silverton, Colorado, May 20, 1886. Known to be an avid prize fight enthusiast, Bat Masterson proved that he was a man who could handle a situation with fists as well as guns. He became a legend in his own time.
Yes, that's the opening segment to the TV show Bat Masterson, Season 1, Episode 5, The Fighter, which aired in 1958. Now, the show exaggerated Bat as a gunfighter, derby hat wearing with fancy clothes, who would take out the meanest, the baddest, and the dirtiest hombres ever in the Wild West. The show had him in his 40s, when actually his last gunfight was when he was 24, and then he headed back east and became a famous journalist. And he is in the Gunslinger Hall of Fame. Your question is, in what city is the Gunslinger Hall of Fame located?
Let's go with Wichita, Nebraska.
Wichita, Nebraska. It would be absolutely incorrect. It's Tombstone, Arizona, which is also the location of the classic Western series from 1957 to 1960, appropriately named Tombstone Territories. It's one of my favorite Westerns. Mike?
Also, I need to redeem myself. I believe Wichita's in Kansas, not Nebraska.
I wasn't going to say anything because you might start singing some Wichita lineman song, and I don't want to do that. Or a Kansas song. I don't want that either. Mike, listen to this. Yes, that's the opening to Annie Oakley, the TV show from 1954. And the opening was great. Her standing up on the saddle of a racing horse and shooting the middle out of a card from a distance at the same time. It was impressive. Annie Oakley was mesmerizing TV. And of course, Annie Oakley is in the Cowgirl Hall of Fame. So your question is, where is the Cowgirl Hall of Fame located?
Galveston, Texas.
Mike, you're so darn close, I'm going to give you credit. It's Fort Worth, Texas.
Yes.
Now, Annie Oakley, real name Phoebe Ann Moses Butler, became an international legend in her own lifetime based on her shooting skills. She was born into poverty in Ohio, and Annie taught herself to shoot to help feed her family. A shooting contest against future husband Frank Butler put her on the road to stardom. In 1885, she joined the Buffalo Bills Wild West show as the only female performer. She traveled the globe as the world champion markswoman, hosting shooting clinics and performing on stage. Strangely enough, although easily the world's most famous cowgirl shooter, well, right up there with Dale Evans, she was not inducted into the Hall of Fame until 1985, even though the hall opened in 1975. Yes, Dale Evans was rightfully entered in the hall in 1995, way too late in my opinion, as well as the opinion of Bullet the Wonder Dog, a dog that should be in a Hall of Fame somewhere. Okay, Mike, third question, listen to this.
One night it was dark and 'twas storming, when along came a tramp in the rain. He was making his way to some station to catch a long-distance train. May I sleep in your barn tonight, mister? It is cold lying out on the ground, and the cold north wind, it is whistling, and I have no place to lie down.
Yes, that's Can I Sleep in Your Barn Tonight? By Vernon Dalhart from 1927. Of course, that's the B-side of the record that featured Hand Me Down My Walking Cane on the A-side. And right now, if our listeners could see, Mike is saying to himself, that's one of Vernon Dalhart's most underrated recordings, which exactly explains why he's a wrestling historian and not a normal person. No doubt Mike could name that song in 3 notes. But your question is, you were once cussed out by a wrestler who worked Madison Square Garden, the Superdome, the Metrodome. You were cussed out by a wrestler that held one specific type of NWA World Championship twice. Mike, so that you don't have to sleep in the barn, who was that wrestler?
That wrestler was Cowboy Lang.
That is 100% correct. You've got 2 out of 3 tonight, but Mike, tell us that story.
Well, the very first time I reffed, Ed Moretti asked if I would be interested in reffing some matches in Medford, Oregon. And I said that I would. On this card was Moretti, 2 girls, Buddy Rose, Little Nasty Boy, and Cowboy Lang. And I was really, really nervous about reffing for Cowboy Lang. He was very nice, but the very first thing I said to him was, I saw you when I was a little boy wrestle in Seaside. And he immediately looks at me, stone face, and says, F you.
That's probably not the last time you were ever cursed out by a wrestler, was it?
Probably not. That was the most memorable for sure.
Mike, that is a terrific cowboy laying story. And he was a terrific wrestler, wrestled a whole bunch here in the Northwest and in Portland. And we just covered him on a recent archive show, podcast that people can listen to and find out more about him. But with that, let's go back to the Hall of Fame episode on Ringside in Rose City. So, Mike, we're back and we're in year 6. And I see one name I thought you would put in year 1, and that's Eric Froelich. Then there's Dean Higuchi, Tex Hager, Bearcat Wright, the sensational original destroyer, Dick Beyer, Dean Silverstone, Pepper Martin, Dory Funk Sr., Howard Cantawine, and Jesse Ventura. Mike, who do you want to talk about here?
Let's talk about Bearcat Wright. He is one of the wrestlers who, a little bit controversial, came to the Northwest. He started wrestling in 1951. He debuted in Vancouver in 1956. He teamed with Don Kindred during that time, another African-American wrestler. He held the tag titles in Vancouver in 1962 with Whipper Watson. In 62, he gets wins over Gene Kaninsky and Hardboiled Haggerty, so he's getting a push. His first time in Portland is in 1965. He wins the tag titles with Shag Thomas, and he gets some world title tag matches with Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. He gets an NWA shot at Kaninsky in Salem. He wins the tag titles with Shag 2 times and also with Billy White Wolf. Now, in 1968, he's still wrestling here, but the interesting thing is he is the United States champ in San Francisco while he's wrestling here, which I thought was very, very interesting. He didn't get pushed that hard as a singles wrestler here to the point where he never was the Northwest champion, but he did win the United States title in San Francisco on 2 different occasions. He also at one point held the WWA World Championship in California. And there was a lot of controversy in that title reign because there came a point where he was supposed to lose and he refused to lose. And that was the way he kept the title. And then they sent Gene LaBelle in to teach him a lesson, and he reportedly just didn't engage at all and just ran out of the ring and left the territory as champ and vacated the title. But that didn't stop him. He was enough of a draw where he didn't get blackballed for that controversy, and he kept wrestling around the country.
Wow, those are great stories. And then a guy who, as a kid, seeing wrestlers with masks in the After magazines, and I would go down to the Rexall store and look at them. Here's one that it didn't really impress me, but as I got older and learned about him, he was a terrific wrestler. That's the sensational original destroyer, Dick Beyer.
Yeah, and I've seen pictures of him without his mask wrestling in Hawaii. He just probably was not going to achieve as much success without a mask. It was just the right time period. He put on a mask. It was a very distinctive mask, a white mask with red around the mouth and red around the eye holes. He was at Dean Silverstone's reunions many, many times. I would say 80% of the time he would wear his mask, even though it was still just with the boys. He would take it off every now and then. Such a nice man. There was one time I came to meet Ed Moretti at the motel, and Dick Beyer was there, and he asked if I would help put his suitcase in the trunk of his car. Just a very, very nice man. He left here and immediately won the World Championship in Los Angeles. Came back like just a standalone show and put Lonnie Main over. So always was great for business.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we move on, give it to anybody else on that list we should talk about.
We can mention Jesse Ventura. You know, one thing that I love to talk about Jesse Ventura, he had a nice solid run, especially for a very green wrestler when he first came in. This was probably his second territory. But the thing that, whenever I talk about Jesse Ventura, the thing that I'm always amazed at, for Jesse's first 6 months, they didn't allow him to say a word. Bull Ramus was his partner. Bull Ramus did all the speaking for him. They just portrayed him as someone who literally couldn't talk. They just had him pose behind Bull Ramus. And then for him to be as articulate as he was, I don't know why they gave him this not saying a word for 6 months.
And that really changed when Buddy Rose came in the area, and immediately, even though Ventura and Ramos were still a tag team, Rose and Ventura started tagging up right away, didn't they?
Yes. In fact, Buddy Rose's first night in, he teams with Jesse Ventura. Buddy Rose starts referring to themselves as the younger generation, and they're going to take over the Northwest. At that point, Jesse starts being able to talk a little bit.
And if you want to give a new guy, a young guy, inexperienced guy, the rub, you put him with Bull Ramos and Buddy Rose, and immediately he's elevated in front of the fans as somebody who must be at the top. And I'm not sure, but did Don give him a finishing move?
He did. He did.
What did he give him?
Well, the full Nelson.
The full Nelson. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. So, I think we've covered so many guys, and there's still so many great names left, but I think we might be out of time. Lisa, how are we doing?
We still have a lot of time left.
Lisa says we've got more time. Great. So let's go to year 7, and the names keep rolling. There's the Grappler, Siegfried Stonke, George Doucette, Andy Tremaine, Stephen Littlebear, Cliff Thide, Haru Sasaki, Ed Wiskowski, Moose Morawski. Mike, who gets featured in this Hall of Fame class?
Stephen Littlebear is an interesting person. He had been kind of a journeyman wrestler around the country, wrestled as Vince Kovac, and there was kind of a question for a little while if he was Sander Kovac's brother, but that was not the case. I believe this is one of the first times he uses the name Stephen Littlebear in Vancouver. Immediate success, wins the championship on one or two occasions in Vancouver, teams with Savage, teams with Don Leo Jonathan, and then comes down to Portland, which was a little unusual. Portland and Vancouver very rarely traded their main eventers, but this was the case. Stephen Littlebear came down, Lonnie Main had left to go to WWF, and Stephen Littlebear immediately teams with Dutch Savage. They win the tag titles. Stephen Littlebear is a natural feud with Bull Ramos, both being Native Americans. And Stephen Littlebear eventually goes to Bill Watts' territory, wins the North American title there, and then he just kind of fades away after that. Haru Suzuki, we've talked a lot about Haru over the years. Haru is a smaller wrestler. Don liked to use Asian wrestlers, I believe. He kind of has a history of that. And Haru homesteads here. This is another wrestler where longevity helps get him in. And Haru, even though Haru was always a heel, I think Haru had his share of fans here in Portland.
On a recent Ringside in Rose City on a Card Shark episode, we talked about Haru Sasaki getting an AWA World title match against Mad Dog Vachon in Omaha, Nebraska. So clearly Haru was well thought of in other locations to be able to get a shot like that, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. That match is really interesting because Haru didn't have a lot of singles success, but obviously in Omaha he did. He earned an AWA title shot. So yeah, very interesting.
And I know you and I have talked about it, but maybe we have a new listener. What did Haru Sasaki use that we learned from Frank Bonema was really dangerous?
Well, judo was okay. Dangerous, of course, but it was fine. But karate was just too dangerous.
There's one particular incident that really sticks out to you about karate, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's my favorite karate story. Haru Suzuki's frequent tag partner, Mr. Fuji, used karate kicks one show and bloodied up Lonnie Main by just the most horrible fashion ever, karate kicks.
Oh, dangerous, deadly, almost like the heart punch. That Haru Sasaki putting his leg over the throat and begging off with the referee and still choking the guy was deadly, deadly. So year 8, and I know there's one name we have to discuss, or one of our loyal listeners will come knocking down our doors. And yes, I'm talking to you, Jody Day. Emil Klanik is on this list. The Sheepherders, Mr. Fuji, Dale Lewis, Steve Dahl, Luthez, who we have talked a ton about on our recent podcast, Luigi Massera, a great wrestler who had a giant role as a ref in the late 60s. And then, of course, your mom's favorite wrestler, Soldat Gorky. So, Mike, right off the bat, before Jody comes for us, let's talk about Steve Dahl.
Steve Dahl comes to the Northwest in the mid-80s, 86, that time period, right before Grappler comes. Steve Dahl literally was one of the best baby faces that I've ever seen. With his look, with his selling ability, with his charisma, He's not going to be considered a tough wrestler, tough babyface along the lines of a Dutch Savage or Lonnie Main. But Steve Dahl definitely drew crowds to Portland with his look, with his tag team that he forms with Scott Peterson and Rex King, the Southern Rockers. So Steve Dahl definitely deserves this spot.
You said that he brought in fans. What kind of fans did he bring in?
They might have brought in the ladies because Steve Dahl was a handsome man.
Yes, that's what our fans always tell us about him. And he was really a talented wrestler. Grappler talks about he even gave the book to Steve Dahl towards the end of the promotion. And so Steve got a run there. A talented wrestler, a great tag team wrestler, a little more than a singles in my mind.
Yeah, definitely. Success in the tag teams. When he had the book, he had a lot of success as a singles wrestler. But he definitely deserved it as well.
Yeah, okay. I think that will keep Jody at bay, at least for a little bit. Now, Mike, there's one more name on that list that I didn't mention because I wanted to give him a proper mention, and that's Frank Bonema. We both grew up listening to his voice. Mike, talk about Frank, how crucial he was to the show, and how he differed from Don Koss, who followed him up.
I talked a little bit about J. Michael Kenyon giving some input. I've always taken input from Matt Farmer. Frank Bonema definitely had a fan that kept pushing for him for at least 3 years prior to him going in, and that's Rich Patterson. Rich Patterson was a Frank Bonema fan. A lot of times it's like somebody speaks up for a wrestler or a wrestling personality in this case, and you think about them and really consider them. And Frank Bonema, he was Portland wrestling. People will remember the wrestlers, Lonnie Main, Tony Bourne, but then Frank Bonema's name also comes into the conversation, which is rare for an announcer. But Frank Bonema had that dry humor. He was such a straight man for the wrestlers. He didn't engage with them as far as arguing with them. He just held the microphone in front, set them up. And Frank Bonema was a really, really good wrestling announcer.
And he had like 15 different hairstyles. So that was always interesting to see. You mentioned Rich Patterson. We want to give a shout out to Rich Patterson because if you're out there and you've been watching any of the Portland wrestling old tapes from the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, almost all of those came from the Buddy Rose collection that Rich Patterson put together and has been uploading them. And so we owe Rich Patterson, all of us, a great deal of thanks. So thank you, Rich Patterson. Now, we're on to the year 9, and one of my favorite wrestlers and gimmicks of all time, Big Tom Andrews, also known as the Claw. There's the Assassins, Ron Bass, Al Shaz, Elton Owen, King Curtis, Herb Freeman, Eddie Sullivan, Doug Donovan, and Strangler Lewis. Mike, I'm not sure who you want to talk about, but I want you to talk about the Claw.
The Claw was such a great gimmick. You know, the mask was so distinct. He comes in not very verbal. You don't know, he immediately gets Beauregard as his manager and tag partner. Tom Andrews had wrestled here for a few years prior to the Claw, and Tom was kind of a mid-card wrestler, but had a really good look to him. But yeah, the Claw wins the Northwest title, feuds with Lonnie Main, wins the tag title with Beauregard, and then turns on Beauregard while they are tag champs, which is an interesting booking strategy in a very interesting match against Haru Suzuki and Mr. Fuji. So you've got that heel tag teams going that Don just loved. And I think the crowd loved it too. They knew so many times when that happened, they're just in for a wild brawl. And to have the Claw turn on Beauregard, Beauregard turns babyface, the Claw starts teaming with Dutch Savage. Really good time period of Portland wrestling.
Absolutely. And using the name The Claw, you didn't have to guess what his finisher was going to be. It was going to be The Claw.
It was going to be the full Nelson.
And you mentioned the Haru Sasaki Fuji match where the Claw and Beauregard break up. And if you find the video on YouTube of Testify, the song by Beauregard, there is a clip at the very end, and it's just a small clip of them breaking up, and Fuji and Sasaki are in the background. But I can remember that match watching it on television like it was yesterday. Absolutely tremendous. What year was the Claw here?
69, 70?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was a young man at that time, and I dressed as the Claw. and sewed my own claw mask and went out as the Claw for Halloween, and everybody recognized me. That shows you how many people really watched Portland wrestling in 69 and 70. It was top of the list. So, well, we've made it to year 10 and still have forever to go. I'm thinking to have Lisa put this envelope back on the wheel for a second run at this, but let's go ahead and look at year 10. There's Rick Martel, Billy White Wolf, Michelle Starr, who is still glaring at you for being Dirk Sheets, Tim Flowers, Johnny Costas, the Dynamite Kid, Duncan McTavish, Earl McCready, Lumberjack Luke, and Fritz von Goring. Mike, let's talk about Rick Martel, because I saw him and Piper live in some very bloody tag matches with the Sheepherders, and those matches are still fresh in my mind.
Rick Martel, along with Steve Dahl, one of the best baby faces that I've ever seen as far as his look, as far as his ability. I once saw a thing online that talked about or speculated what Portland wrestler was the most NWA champion ready, which means what wrestler could you picture moving into that position? A lot of people said Roddy Piper. I don't think Roddy Piper ever would have been the NWA champion because Roddy Piper was a draw without the title. And also, Roddy Piper might not have been the most reliable wrestler. But they gave it to Ric Flair, so maybe Piper would have done just fine. But my thought was Rick Martel was probably the most champion-ready wrestler, this side of Don Leo Jonathan, of course. It proved to be true because he ends up being the AWA World's Champion. And his run here was so solid. He got a shot at Harley Race very, very early, within about a month of arriving here. So yeah, Rick Martel definitely deserves to be in the Hall of Fame.
And you mentioned a solid run, but not a really long run. He comes in November of 79 and is here through all of 80 and really in a lot of tag matches with Roddy Piper against the Sheepherders, as I mentioned, just absolutely solid. And then, of course, the Sheepherders turn on Buddy Rose, and we're off to the races on another one. So, Mike, who else is on that list that you should talk about?
Well, Michelle Starr and Tim Flowers literally have to go in together. Their relationship, they were not friends as far as promoting, but they actually were friendly to each other. But I could picture if one of them went in before the other, Flowers would not care. Or he would claim that he didn't care, and Starr wouldn't care either. But it just seems fitting that they should go in together. And Dynamite Kid, who was just one of the most fantastic wrestlers that I ever saw. We got to see him in his prime, 1983. You forgot about his size because he was so strong, so tough, and such a good wrestler. His matches with Kurt Hennig, the Wrestling Observer, said that they were the best matches in the world at the time. So that's quite an accomplishment and quite a feather in Portland Wrestling's hat. But yeah, Dynamite Kid definitely deserves this.
And Portland had never really seen anybody like the Dynamite Kid, but in Portland, he was simply amazing.
Yeah, definitely. I think Don, he was an action-packed wrestler. I think Don liked that.
Yes, he was. And he was part of the really important angle in Portland wrestling, wasn't he?
He was involved with the Buddy Rose babyface turn. He was begging for Dynamite Kid to come out to help him because Buddy Rose thought that Dynamite Kid was going to be his tag partner. But then Dynamite Kid joined Rip Oliver's crew and turned on Buddy Rose.
And Rose is the face for about a year, and not a great face run, but really memorable in Portland because the fans filled the ring like never before, lifting up on their shoulders, and the Dynamite Kid's a big part of that. So, Mike, I want to make sure that we get halfway through it because you got 22 years. But so let's talk about year 11. And on year 11, we've got Herb Owen, Bill Dromo, who you've mentioned earlier, David Sierra, who we know by a zillion other names, Chris Colt, Pat Patterson, the Mad Russian, Scotty the Body, Ricky Hunter, Henry Lentz, and Ivan Kamaroff.
I really like this crew of wrestlers because you try and balance the eras and Portland and Vancouver. So we've got Chris Colt, the first one that I'd like to talk about. And once again, Chris Colt is not on top in Portland. He did have some success in Vancouver, but he had a lot of success for Dean Silverstone's promotion. He's the type of guy who gets beat every week in Portland, and suddenly you go, that Chris Colt's really a good wrestler, even though he'd been beaten the last 3 months every week. You kind of just realize all of a sudden how talented he is. Scotty the Body, Raven. I love the story, and it was kind of confirmed on an interview that we did with Grappler, I believe, where Scotty had been in Vancouver, comes down to Portland with no prior warning or advance, lets him know at the door that he'd love to meet with the powers that be. Roddy Piper's in the area. Piper says, let's give him a shot on the microphone. I think he impressed everybody as Don Coss's co-commentator. He had that quick sense of humor, that quick wit. And then, a couple weeks in, they let him wrestle. They must have had him work out a little bit, saw that he could more than hold his own in the ring. He had great success here in Portland.
So Scotty was also one of the first who Portland brought in a valet. And so we talked about Veronica and Ginger. They weren't female wrestlers, but they were the valets for Scotty the Body. Although they did get into a match together. Mike, how did that match go?
Yeah, that was great because you have to hand it to the grappler who booked that, because he gave them a chance to be on top of a Portland wrestling card, Veronica and Ginger, with no skill whatsoever. And he just said, we didn't want him to be wrestling. He said, we wanted a cat fight. And they went out there and they did that. And you have to hand it to them and have to hand it to the booking, because that card was a sellout and they were on top.
And Don Coss famously said something about that match.
Yeah, he's alluded to the fact that these girls are not wrestlers.
Oh, that's amazing. So, Mike, another name on that list that I want to ask you about, because it could be any number of people, because Portland's had a lot of Russians come through here. Talk about the Mad Russian.
The Mad Russian also wrestled as Stan Pulaski in different territories, especially probably achieved most success in the Omaha area. He also wrestled as a third Vachon brother, Dan Vachon. He was here early in the early 60s, had a nice run here, won the Northwest Championship, was also tag champs, at least on one occasion. So yeah, he really fit in. Don Owen likes that gimmick, the German or Russian gimmick, Asian gimmick, and that fit into Portland just perfectly.
Yeah, a fairly big man, wasn't he?
Yeah, he and Butcher Vachon, I've seen pictures of them, not the same body style, but size. He definitely was a big man.
And while we won't talk about him too much right now, but David Sierra, for listeners who just hear that name and are fairly new to the Portland wrestling era, who is David Sierra, and did he use any gimmicks here?
He did. He started out as the Destroyer, not the original Destroyer, but the Destroyer. Went away for a while, came back as the Assassin, and achieved a lot of success. Went away and came back as Top Gun, and was definitely, I believe, a babyface all of his Top Gun run.
Yeah, David Sierra, who we also booked when I was promoting Portland wrestling, a great guy. We recently saw him at the Portland Wrestling Expo #1 and #2, him and Fantasy, his wife, and we want to say hi to Dave Sierra. We understand he's had some health issues lately, but doing good. So Dave, hang in there. We're thinking about you. Well, Mike, tonight really has reminded me of something. History isn't just about remembering the biggest stars. It's about remembering the people who mattered. Some of the names we talked about tonight became household names. Others may be only remembered by longtime Northwest fans. But every one of them helped build the wrestling scene that generations of fans enjoyed. And that's really what made the Ring Around the Northwest Hall of Fame special. It wasn't a popularity contest. It wasn't based on television ratings. It definitely wasn't based on who sold the most t-shirts. It was about impact, who changed things, who drew money, who entertained fans, who left the Northwest wrestling business better than they found it. And what struck me tonight is that after all these years, we're still talking about them. We're still telling their stories, or you're telling them, and we're still learning things about them. And that's probably the greatest Hall of Fame honor anyone can receive. And that's being remembered. Now, Mike, we've only opened the first few pages of these Hall of Fame lists. We've got 22 Hall of Fame classes sitting there, stacks of newsletters, hundreds of names, promoters, referees, announcers, managers, wrestlers, and we've only gone through 11 years. And we've got enough stories to keep us busy for a very long time. And of course, tonight wasn't all serious wrestling history, because somewhere in the middle of all this, Lisa decided to drag us into another Hall of Fame edition of Kayfabe Curveballs. And somehow we went from Gorgeous George and Don Owen to gunfighters, cowgirls, Cowboy Lang, and Mike being cussed out. Honestly, that's a fairly normal episode around here. And fortunately for all of us, there was no Foxtrot tonight. No Popeye theme song that sounds like this.
Popeye the Sailor Man. Popeye the Sailor Man.
No demonstration of the highly classified Squirrel Paws tactical defense system. For that, we are all grateful. Mike, great stories tonight. Any final thoughts on the Hall of Fame? The first half.
The first half is primarily wrestlers who really stood out, had great runs, or they homesteaded, spent a lot of time here. And I like that all these wrestlers get remembered because they all definitely put in their time and had success and were part of Portland wrestling.
Absolutely great stories from you tonight, Mike. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us as we continue to preserve the history of Portland wrestling and the Pacific Northwest, because every name has a story and every story has a place. And every once in a while, that place is the Hall of Fame. Now, Mike and I thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And be sure to subscribe and support Mike and I in that way. We really do appreciate it. And new episodes drop every Friday. So until next time, I'm Frank Culbertson alongside Hall of Famer
Mike Rodgers.
And this has been Ringside in Rose City. As we say, that's wrestling. Wrestling the way it should be. Lisa, lock up the Hall of Fame vault on your way out. We have a feeling we're going to need it again.
And that's a wrap from Ringside in Rose City, where one ring, one city, and 1,000 stories never fail to deliver. I'm Lisa Hughes, and this has been a Yaski production. Catch every episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your wrestling fix. Until next time, keep your boots laced, your popcorn buttered, and your stories ready.